Okay, welcome to our winter session of Another Look. We were talking before coming, when this thing all started, and it's kind of scary to think that it's been going on for, 2012, something. Yeah. Anyway, we're not dead yet. So before we start, a few thanks. And Roland Green, the head of the Humanities Center, has graciously allowed us to use Leventhal Hall free of charge. Patrizia Terrazia, who is in charge of the logistics of this room, has also been very helpful in terms of the logistics. Thanks as always to our administrator, Cynthia Haven, for everything she's done for Another Look. And sitting next to her, Robert Edgars. He has been our tech savior for the last several sessions, and he's the one who records, posts, and so over to you. Be technically safe here while we conduct these sessions, where he's the one who allows us to do the thinking without worrying. Continuing studies, although it doesn't support us to the degree that it did in the past, is still a contributor to us, and we thank them. There's also some donors, two in particular, that I'd like to thank for their very generous contributions. Antonia Cross is a longtime devotee of Entitled Opinions, and we thank her for her donation. Also, Mary Pope Osborne, who is that children's writer, very well known, I'm sure, to many of you. I've never met her myself. She's in her home in Maine, but she saw reason to donate, another generous sum to adult literacy. She's a big supporter of child literacy, but we also appreciate her gesture to keep us going. So we're going to be reading and discussing today Bartleby, the novella by Herman Melville. And this is, I can imagine, a book that many of you have shown up tonight, either in person or online. We have the same amount of audience, at least, if not more, online, who is following us tonight. Obviously, looking for answers to questions that this novella raises, which is, what is going on with Bartleby? What is his motivation? What kind of disorder? It's a hermeneutic challenge. It's almost like a black hole that we enter into. And I know, having reviewed a lot of the commentary and interpretations, that black hole has produced any number of fantastications and hallucinations about what the meaning of this book is. So I'm looking forward, in particular, to the discussion from our panelists. Now, there's a line in Bartleby in the first paragraph that is often cited: I believe no material exists for a full and satisfactory biography of this man, Bartleby. It is an irreparable loss to literature, he says. But it takes a genius like Melville to take an irreparable loss to literature to write a literary masterpiece about such a loss, no? So we are going to find out what this irreparable loss is all about. And I'm eager to hear what our panelists have to say. So we're going to start off with my own brother, Thomas Harrison, who is a professor of in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at UCLA, the author of several books, most recently a book on bridges, a poetic and philosophical account. Tom will be followed by Katie Peterson, a remarkable poet who I've known for a few years. She's an award-winning poet who has authored 7 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. Katie, is that right? Yeah, and most recently, a collection called Fog and Smoke, unfortunately, the Stanford bookstore was not, you got one there, yeah. I'm going to purchase my own copy after the event because the bookstore that has a number of books from some of the panelists here was not able to get enough copies or from the publisher because this book has just come out this week. Is that right? So she has kindly brought a number. Yeah. 10 or dozen copies, and anyone who is interested in purchasing, there's a whole system where I think a credit card will do it, right? I will be first in line because I haven't read the book yet. Katie is also professor of English at UC Davis and currently directs the graduate creative writing program at Davis. She's a Menlo Park native and got her PhD from Harvard, but her BA comes from Stanford, so she's really one of our own. And after Katie, we'll hear some thoughts from our own Tobias Wolff. He's the founder of Another Look, and therefore he needs no introduction to this audience. And I've said on almost every occasion that we've had Toby on our panel that he is one of America's national treasures. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he'll be followed by Katie and then Toby, and then we'll open it up to discussion, Q&A. So over to you.
Thank you, Robert. It's an honor for me to be here. And I think the reason I am is because some years ago, I told Robert that Bartleby was the best short story ever written. Now, at the time, I hadn't read The Lady with the Dog by Anton Chekhov. And I've reread Bartleby since, but I still would consider it one of the very best stories I've ever read. And I thought what I would do with you today is to give some very simple reasons why. We'll leave all the mysteries till later. The first reason, the strength of the narrator. It's a strange but undeniable fact that in all acts of narrative, who tells the story is almost as important as what the story that's told. That is to say, the appeal of stories is always tied up with the way they're told. I'm sure all of you can think of good storytellers and those who will screw up even the funniest episode. Well, the narrator of Bartleby is one of the first, and he's a real character, the likes of which we do not have anymore today. And that's what also makes the story a little difficult to follow, is the way he speaks. He certainly has more personality than Bartleby, the titular hero of the story. The lawyer narrator's stilted, circumlocutive description of everything that happens, his legal-mindedness at all moments, is like a rare gourmet dish, very elaborate, over-seasoned, and thus highly interesting. And without intending to be, he is amusing and funny. And let's be honest, so too are the other two characters whose names do not get into the title of the story, Turkey and Nippers. Why, they seem to be lifted right out of a Dickens novel, both subject to their digestive humors, which they can no more control than Bartleby can control his own indisposition. Bartleby, who is unable to say why he would prefer not, at any particular moment, to do what's asked of him. Nippers and Turkey may obey orders better than Bartleby, but if it's the wrong time of day, they cannot carry them out any better. Just think about how Nippers spends most of the morning feuding with his desk, I quote, as if the table were a perverse voluntary agent intent on thwarting and vexing him, end quote. And how these other words of the narrator also direct us to what Nippers shares with Bartleby. I quote again, he put chips under the table, blocks of various sorts, pits of pasteboard, but no invention would help. In short, the truth of the matter was Nippers knew not what he wanted. or if he wanted anything, it was to be rid of a scrivener's table altogether. Nipper's functionality, then, all depends on how he feels. And the narrator even concedes this about his official aide, that, quote, when he chose, Nippers was not deficient in a gentlemanly sort of deportment. Notice the emphasis on when he chose, and the double negative, he was not deficient. And then there's Turkey, the dipsomaniac, whose alcohol problem begins after lunch, and who always answers the lawyers with the words, with submission, sir, but not without necessarily submitting any more than Nippers does. When our narrator asks him to not bother to come in the afternoon at all, for he creates ink blots on the documents he's copying, Turkey replies like this, true, but with submission, sir, behold these hairs. I'm getting old. Surely, sir, a blot or two of a warm afternoon is not to be severely urged against gray hairs. Old age, even if it blot the page, is honorable. With submission, sir, we are both getting old. This appeal to my fellow feeling, the lawyer observed, was hardly to be resisted. At all events, I saw that go he would not. He wouldn't leave the office for the afternoons. The point is, not just that the eccentricities of these characters are involuntary, as the narrator says of Bartleby, and that they are subject to their humors, their indigestion, and their physiological tics. And notice that these are forces with which one cannot reason. But the point is also, in fact, no more than one can reason with Bartleby. The point is that they share, these characters, a kind of compulsive and resistant character with Bartleby. And this brings me back to our narrator, whose perspectives and subjectivity make a story out of all this. For he too shares a strange and uncanny relationship with Bartleby. Don't forget that it is he who reports everything we know about the scrivener, leading some readers to question whether he is even an unreliable narrator, and may be, in fact, coloring the facts that he presents to us. Well, one thing is sure, Bartleby creates problems for him and for the legal activities to which he is dedicated. A lot of questions arise right here in consideration of the fact that the lawyer applies all of his efforts, in his own words, to doing, quote, a snug business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. The client whose name he's most proud to drop is the first multimillionaire in US history, John Jacob Astor, who made his fortunes by establishing a monopoly on the fur trade in the continent and by smuggling heroin into China and through real estate investments in New York City. Some critics wonder whether this story about Bartleby, preferring not to assess the accuracy of his legal copies, does not in fact amount to a critique of institutionalized capitalism. Consider that initially Bartleby is happy to copy documents, but not to assess the validity of these copies. Well, there are many interpretations of this character Bartleby, the figure, and one of them considers him to be a Christ-like figure, who prefers not to partake in this structural inequity. I generally like that approach, and we'll tell you why in a minute. But first, I'd just like to stay focused on this less controversial fact, namely that Bartleby poses a deep problem for the lawyer narrator. I mean, the stories about the interaction between them. Just as submitting or not submitting was an issue for Nippers and Turkey, so it is for the lawyer too. And apparently, through some sort of subtle and uncanny conversion that he undergoes at the hands of his scrivener Bartleby. It occurs each and every time the lawyer butts up against what he calls Bartleby's passive resistance. When he encounters that resistance, what happens is that the lawyer resolves not to do what he intends to do. That is, he intends to fire him. And each and every time he resolves not to do what he intends to do. It becomes so extreme that finally he prefers to vacate the premises and the lease of his own office, rather than more reasonably to throw Bartleby out. Here's an account of one of 3 or 4 occasions in which he determines not to put up with Bartleby's behavior and becomes particularly enraged. "Bartleby," I roared, very like a ghost, agreeably to the laws of magical invocation. At this third summons, he appeared at the entrance of his hermitage. "Go to the next room and tell Nippers to come to me." "I prefer not to," he respectfully and slowly said, and mildly disappeared. "Very good, Bartleby," I said, in a quiet, sort of serenely severe, self-possessed tone, imitating the unalterable purpose of some terrible retribution, very close at hand. At the moment, I half intended something of the kind. But upon the whole, as it was drawing towards my dinner hour, I thought it best to put on my hat and walk home for the day, suffering much from perplexity and distress of mind. On another occasion, the lawyer publicly enlists the support of his 3 other employees in the office to give what he calls, quote, some reinforcement for his own faltering mind, that is, to impose himself on Bartleby. "You hear what they say," said I, turning towards the screen, behind which Bartleby is. "Come forth and do your duty." But he vouchsafed no reply. I pondered a moment in sore perplexity. But once more business hurried me. I determined again to postpone the consideration of this dilemma to my future leisure. Of course, the critical scene of Bartleby's passive resistance occurs when the lawyer, on his way to Sunday Mass, and here's where we get to this sort of Christ-like issue, on his way to Sunday Mass, discovers that Bartleby sleeps in the office. After witnessing the living traces of this utterly forlorn, forsaken, homeless creature in his office, the lawyer engages in a series of Christianizing reflections, refers to Matthew, which altogether obliterate his own reasons for going to church. That is, he goes to church clearly just out of habit. But when he has to face this homeless person, then things change. And so he ends by saying, "I did not accomplish the purpose of going to Trinity Church that morning. Somehow, the things I had seen disqualified me for the time from church going." Bartleby then confounds the lawyer's either-ors. That's why he, the lawyer, prefers not to discipline Bartleby, but rather to seek another, still utterly unclear course of action, unclear as is Bartleby's own action. Bartleby's disposition, or rather his indisposition, proves contagious. And this is another reason why this is such an excellent story. Its themes and motifs are reproduced at different levels of the literary structure, all over the place. Its meaning pervades the various components that compose the story, each dramatic event, the trajectory of the plot, the imagery, and the narrative language used by the lawyer. We've already seen how Bartleby's vacillation and resistance to action is reflected in the behavior of the other 3 characters, all suspended to some extent between doing and not doing, between clear and categorical choices on which the proper exercise of the law and industry depends. But one also finds the meanings of the story conveyed by way of the physical locations, by the architectural structures that make it into the writer's descriptions. And I'll give you just 1, maybe 2 examples of these in closing, because the most prominent, as you will have noticed, is the image of walls, an image stuck into the story so many times that it becomes a symbol. It first appears in the subtitle of Bartleby, which tells us that this is a story of Wall Street. Throughout, Bartleby stands and stares out of his window at a wall 3 feet away. He's continually subject to, quote, dead wall reveries. Though, of course, we learn nothing about these reveries, because Bartleby himself is a wall to psychological investigation. Before he dies, our lawyer finds him in the so-called tombs, staring at a wall outside in the yard. By the way, the word tombs, used to designate the halls of justice, which is itself a fancy way of referring to the prison, the word tombs also calls attention to itself. These tombs, or halls of justice, suggest that this is a place where you end up dying, immured as though in the pyramids, walled in. In fact, when Bartleby does die, our narrator says he's gone to join kings and counselors, the highest members of society, alluding with that phrase to the dignified suffering of Job in the Bible. With this image of walls goes also the image of Bartleby's constant immobile standing. Bartleby, quote, is a motionless young man. He is, quote, singularly sedate, like, quote, the last column of some ruined temple. He remains standing mute. So, meaning operates in mysterious ways, and the greatest writer is the one who enacts such mysteries in the most complex and compelling ways. This is the last virtue I wanted to stress in explaining the virtues of the story. Its impenetrability, its irreducibly mysterious nature, because since we can't figure Bartleby out, who mesmerizes our attention in the matter of an unknown sign, we understand that every great story is great only because it makes us ponder it over and over and doesn't release its secrets. Thank you.
That was terrific. I'm Katie, and I'm so honored that Robert asked me to be here with these wonderful thinkers who are also wonderful writers, and you should check their writing out as well. And I think there's another reason why Robert asked me to be here. It's because a bunch of years ago, I was on the Entitled Opinions podcast talking about Emily Dickinson. And I think about Dickinson with Melville and with Henry David Thoreau to be part of a movement of great American naysayers that may have been located at one point in the 19th century, but extends in time and space to our own century. And so I'm happy to be talking about this story in which preferring not to is one of the central features. As literary people in this day and age, it's part of our fashion to situate ourselves as members of a community and to talk about that in terms of race, class, gender, citizenship. So I want to start by doing that. And I want all of you to know that I'm the daughter of a lawyer. So my reading of Bartleby starts with this principle. I feel the similarity between the scrivener's office, a sort of law office managed by the narrator, and the human family keenly, having grown up with a precocious, because necessary, sense of the entwined nature of cleverness and drudgery that is the lawyer's craft. If you know, you know. Having grown up doing my own homework at the same table as someone's billables. Lawyers are notoriously leaky about the boundaries between their work and their life, maybe like poets. I grew up modeling my family life in some sense on the legal office. And how is a family so different than a legal office? Both can be dogmatic about marking time with ritual, constant in their adherence to an interpretation of rules. A curfew is a kind of statute, and so is a restriction on screen time, I'm finding as the mother of a 6-year-old. Persistent, but often surprisingly flexible in their institution of hierarchies like rank and authority, since we all know the youngest and the slowest control family life. What I'm trying to say is that it's easy for me to see the narrator and his scriveners and assistants as a version of a family, and for me to see the family as a microcosm of the world. And then additionally, as a lawyer's daughter, it's difficult for me to look upon Bartleby without judgment, without testing him to an argument of some kind. I begin with the glancing observation that Bartleby, the character, is annoying and compelling. I realize at this point I've descended completely into the narrator. Tom has just spent some beautiful moments unpacking. Allow me to continue by offering 2 arguments and a possible resolution to them. Argument number 1 is that Bartleby is bad. Obviously, Bartleby is bad, a malignant force that represents some measure of society's ills, the things that hurt us. Each of these arguments will have 7 principles, so don't worry, by the time you get to 5, you're almost done. 1, Bartleby is bad because he is easily diagnosable by our standards as a depressive. Quote, I observed that he never went to dinner. Indeed, he never went anywhere. Soaking up bad energy seems like part of Bartleby's game plan, part of his MO, and then spitting it back at his boss. Number 2, Bartleby is potentially diagnosable by our standards as an anorexic. He lives then on ginger nuts. Thought I never eats a dinner, properly speaking. He must be a vegetarian then. But no, he never eats vegetables. He eats nothing but ginger nuts. 2, wasted Bartleby. To the end of the story, his dinner is ready. Won't he dine today either, or does he live without dining? Lives without dining, said I, and closed his eyes. Melville's narrator speaks of the meager recital of Bartleby's internment and describes his cadaverously gentlemanly nonchalance. Anorexia, I've learned from friends and from literary scholars, is a fundamentally antisocial position, one in which personal control stands in for an impossible to achieve control over one's surrounding world. It's a fatal model. 3, Bartleby makes productive endeavor impossible, even when it saves him time. These are your own copies we are about to examine. It is labor saving to you because one examination will answer for your 4 papers. It is common usage. Every copyist is bound to examine his copy. Is it not so? Will you not speak? Answer. I prefer not to, he replied in a flute-like tone. 4, Bartleby refuses to compromise, and compromise is the soul of social life. Say now that you will help to examine papers tomorrow or the next day. In short, say now that in a day or 2 you will begin to be a little reasonable. Say so, Bartleby. At present, I would prefer not to be a little reasonable. 5, Bartleby has no boundaries. If we say, according to Robert Frost, another one of my naysayers, good fences make good neighbors, Bartleby has really bad fences. He doesn't just start living in the office, he starts living in the mind of the narrator. I know that the expression lives rent-free in someone's head doesn't come from the story, but by the end of it, it's as if it should. 6, Bartleby doesn't have a clear sense of purpose or any sense of purpose. He also doesn't have any clear needs, and he seems impossible to help. There's nothing worse than a person who is impossible to help. Am I right? The narrator writes, if he would have but named a single relative or friend, I would instantly have written and urged their taking the poor fellow away to some convenient retreat. But he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe, a bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic. 7, Bartleby is bad because he has a small vocabulary. Argument number 2, Bartleby is good. Obviously, Bartleby is good, and in his passive resistance represents a higher, no, angelic model of civic engagement, more angelic than the conventional version. He could help us understand the good. 1, Bartleby possesses a beautiful and refined melancholy, which enables a rare intimacy with the other, in this case, with the narrator. But there was something about Bartleby that not only strangely disarmed me, but in a wonderful manner touched and disconcerted me. This is early in the story, but there are any number of moments in which the narrator credits his acts of imagination, empathy, sympathy, and thinking to Bartleby himself. 2, Bartleby has a complex feeling about the basic consolation and survival mechanism of food, which puts him on the level of mystics and elite sensibilities with kings and counselors. Melville's narrator calls his desk a hermitage. Bartleby refuses food as consolation for losing his place in the world at the end of the story, the narrator's office. When the narrator pays to put food in his mouth, Bartleby reminds him in word and in deed that what he wished for was something else. Bartleby stands against consumerism, against stress eating, and against all the pleasures of our postmodern society. 3, Bartleby stands behind his work, requires no assistance, no fact-checking, no training, for the most part, little accommodation while he chooses to do his work. The narrator finds he must speak Bartleby's praises. As the days passed on, I became considerably reconciled to Bartleby. his steadiness, his freedom from all dissipation, his incessant industry, except when he chose to throw himself into a standing reverie behind the screen, his great stillness, his unalterableness of demeanor under all circumstances made him a valuable acquisition. And this is one of many times that the narrator talks about Bartleby's value. The point isn't that Bartleby can't do his work, but that he won't. This won't leaves forever open the possibility that he will do it if certain conditions might be met. Who are we to know that they're unreasonable? We still don't know. What we know is that we don't know what they are yet. 4, Bartleby is limited and knows his limits, says his limits, and is a clear communicator about his limits, which is more than I can say about some people I've been in a relationship with. 5, Bartleby can see through walls. He points out those boundaries between people and things that are invisible. Quote, one prime thing was this: he was always there, first in the morning, continually through the day, and the last at night. I had a singular confidence in his honesty. When Bartleby begins to live in the office, he essentially points out the negative space of all the personnel of all the office, how that's implied and implicated by their work. By living in the office, he points out, by refusing to work, their actual interdependence with each other, the lives that they can't see that they're all leading. He lets them see. 6, Bartleby does not simply follow the actions of others and does not simply do what they do or think. You would never catch Bartleby at a football game or a political rally. He gives others a sense of purpose. The narrator says, at last I see it, I feel it, I penetrate to the predestinated purpose of my life, I am content. Others may have loftier parts to enact, but my mission in this world, Bartleby, is to furnish you with office room for such period as you may see fit to remain. 7, like food, Bartleby uses in language only what he needs to, rendering more eloquent the small posse of words that is necessary for use, almost like a poet, which is shown by the fact that his words are as contagious as internet memes, catching fire, as if he's building up the meaning of the word prefer again from the ground up, as if Melville is calling attention to language as a renewable rather than simply relatable system. Nippers and Turkey start using the word prefer, and the word starts to take on almost magical meanings. I think these can be funny, comical, and satirical, and they can still remain magical in this way. So finally, this is the last part. What if Bartleby is not a binary, but a spectrum? He's not bad or good, but something else. The point of Bartleby is not that he's a pestilence or an angel, but he's what Adrienne Rich would call in her notebooks on poetry and politics, a wick of desire, a figure to think with. A person who is not ascertainable points out to us the limits of what we have found ascertainable thus far. 1, Bartleby would prefer to remain with you, he says to the narrator. He is passive resistance, which everyone hates, but he's your passive resistance. He belongs to you and shows you something about yourself that also matters to your community. This is what the narrator says. In my intent frame of mind, I had, as it were, imagined that all Broadway shared in my excitement and were debating the same question with me. Remember that part towards the end of the story where he sort of hallucinates that everyone else is thinking about Bartleby too? Well, I mean, I think this is funny, but you can also see this as only as a condition of hallucination, or you can see it the way I do, a waking dream that points out the truth that all of society is implicated in how we treat the Bartlebys among us. 2, Bartleby sees the part of us, of all of us, that's more than just a scrivener. The narrator asks him, what earthly right have you to stay here? Do you pay any rent? Do you pay my taxes? Or is this property yours? He answered nothing. It's not an earthly right that Bartleby is assuming to stay in the office. It's some other kind of right that Bartleby shapes in the imagination, an obligation towards others that supersedes both money and the obligation to be civil, or points out that sometimes we're apt to confuse the two. 3, Bartleby reminds you of what true freedom actually is. The narrator says to Bartleby, now one of 2 things must take place. Either you must do something or something must be done to you. He briefly gave me to understand on this point my judgment was sound, But yes, his decision was irreversible. This to me is a horrific statement. Now, one of two things must take place. Either you must do something or something must be done to you. The purpose of the story is to trouble this conventional wisdom about human life and leave that trouble, profitably or no, in the middle of the human family. Isn't this sort of terrible thing to say about people? Aren't they both in the shared predicament of work? And aren't work stoppages sometimes necessary, as we've seen in the last few years? 4, Bartleby's lack of compromise provokes the narrator into a moral imagination, a set of speculations about another person, guesses and questions, and finally acts of charity, which may be useless in this case, but might indeed be connected to civic actions that matter later. The point isn't whether the narrator's moral imagination works, or works in this case, but that he shows himself to have it because of Bartleby. 5, Bartleby redraws the boundaries in a way that enlarges the conscience. The same kind of logic that says that the tillers of the field, rather than the owners of the vineyard, should have the fruits of their labor. The workers of the office should have the office. 6, Bartleby helps us question whether our sense of purpose and its conventional terms are valid. Money and respectability are the ones on the chopping block here. Somehow the things I had seen disqualified me from church going, says the narrator. And 7, Bartleby shows that our best use of language possesses, rather than bravado or bluster or even any personal eloquence, a sort of a kind of like grace and eloquence, a kind of pirouetting conditioned by necessity, what one has to say at any moment in time, and by interdependence with others, what one says to others and in the context of others as well. It's not that he has a small vocabulary, it's that he's using wisely the large vocabulary he has in small conditions. That's all I got.
Thank you, Katie. That was wonderful. To return just for a moment to the subtitle of this story, A Story of Wall Street. And it's been mentioned how great a part walls play in this story. It's Bartleby looking in that dead wall stare at this. He's already, in a sense, entombed in this office with this brick wall, sooty brick wall 3 feet away. And also, let us not forget that the narrator has erected a wall within the office, this sliding wall, to shield Bartleby from his view. So in every way he turns, Bartleby is walled in, and walled in as well by the nature of his work, to copy, to endlessly reproduce something that has been produced by somebody else. And this always for the benefit of those whom the narrator speaks of so reverently when he invokes the name John Jacob Astor, a name he loves to say, for it hath about it a golden orbicular ring. So even the conditions of the office themselves form a system of walls in which preference does not have a natural part. It is a place where you go to do rote work. It is, in fact, a kind of industrial model. And the inability of the narrator to countenance, to truly understand and adapt to this, to try to figure out some way to do the operation of a human will within this system, is, I think, that one of the things that the story challenges, not only the narrator, but the reader with, that this is not a system that's alien to us. Melville, as we know, is best known for his for the work that he has set at sea. But Moby Dick, of course, but also White Jacket, the great story Billy Budd, Benito Cereno, the Encantadas, these great stories. And you can, this of course seems like a departure from that, but you can read this story in a sense as being a kind of model of a ship. The confinement of this office, you get no sense of the world outside this. And at one point, as Katie quoted, talked about someone being, Bartleby being a wreck in mid-Atlantic. What is the rule of the sea? If you come upon a craft in distress or people cast away in a raft, the law of the sea is to come to their aid. And the narrator, the captain of this leaky vessel, is similarly feels that nautical compulsion to come to the aid of this man who's adrift. So this is very much actually in Melville's tradition, this story. And it's also, I think, a really funny story. The mental gyrations, I mean, frankly, I have a lot of sympathy for the lawyer who runs this office, probably more than I should have. But these mental acrobatics he's constantly performing of how to deal with this situation, how to deal with this character, to the point, which I think is the kind of coup de grace of comedy in there, where he moves his own office to solve the problem, not kick the guy out, but actually transport himself to another place. And I love the delegation of new tenants who show up at his new digs to protest this legacy he has left them of Bartleby. So there's a kind of comedy at work in this story that is wonderfully playing off this deeper tragic current of this man who the system, who cannot be adapted, who cannot adapt himself to this system. And what challenge that presents to a man who of decency and conscience. It presents a kind of problem that I think we feel generally when confronted with suffering that we feel a human compulsion to do something about and don't know how to meet. It's something we all, anyone with, any of us in this room live with this all the time. How do we meet human suffering? Not just those in our immediate circle, and every one of us has someone like that, but the world at large. And it's a challenge that this narrator, this lawyer, is trying his best to work out. And it is not clear to me that he could have done any better than what he does in this story. I don't know what that would have been, because Bartleby himself, in a sense, has moved beyond the kind of help that we are able to give. So why don't we embark on a more general conversation?
thanks all of our discussants. Thank you. That very thought-provoking. I hope the audio quality is very good for the immortality of this recording for future generations. Yeah, I just want to say a few things in terms of how I took the three commentaries. One, where Katie spoke about the great American naysayers. I think you mentioned Melville, Emily Dickinson, and there are other, as an American citizen with European, background, but sympathies, what makes me most proud of being an American is the literary tradition that has come out. And I'm talking about people like Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, Thoreau, Emerson, and a few others. And, when you have that cast of characters in your own kind of national heritage, that's more than you can ask, to be proud of. So Melville is really at the very top of this list of people who I feel like I can live with forever and never get to the bottom. The depths of his stories, Moby Dick, obviously the big one, but also Bartleby. Now, Tom spoke about I was very glad that, Turkey and Nippers, Ginger Nut didn't get much airtime, but he's another one, all eccentrics. And therefore, all these interpretations, because I was reviewing the interpretations as much as I could, before tonight's session, and many of them were speaking about the way that Wall Street dehumanizes and it demands conformity and everyone has to play their role and so forth. And yet, I think, as Toby was saying, this office is full of eccentrics just as weird as Bartleby. So Bartleby is just one among at least 3 or 4 of them, including the narrator. And that, for me, confirms the fact that the narrator has a certain tolerance for weirdness. And therefore, many of the critics who find that the narrator is morally culpable for not finding a way to get to Bartleby I think it's a misdirected interpretation of the fact that, of course, he's not morally perfect, but who is morally perfect? And therefore, as you were suggesting, you can take 2 different views, bad, good, but bad, good's not going to do it. It's something else. And Toby, what you were saying, that how many of us don't know someone who suffers from, it's not so much just suffering in itself, where there's an unreachability, where somehow that person could be right in front of you, right next to you, and you can't get through to them because there's this invisible wall that surrounds them. And it's this inability to come to the aid of a fellow, either family member, or fellow citizen, or just a fellow human being, that is part of the dilemma of this narrator, where anyway, I think that we all agree that in the final analysis, this is really a story about compassion and the difficulties and impossibility of compassion under certain circumstances, where someone refuses to, it's not that Bartleby has a quiet refusal to be helped, but he doesn't make it at all easy, And therefore, I don't know, we will open it up to further.
You won't even take money.
Yeah, and he there's this quote there. The narrator speaks about the hopelessness of remediating excessive and organic ill. And at a certain point, that's almost like Simone Weil when she's speaking about affliction, that there's something that you just can't, it's excessive and you can't deal with it. The narrator is human. He's not superhuman, and he makes every good effort, in my view, humanly possible effort to work it out. But yeah, maybe there's something in Bartleby that he's either a mystic or he is the bad guy or something, but what is one to do after a certain point? And so that's where we reach a wall, also a wall of interpretation. We don't, at a certain point, Bartleby is beyond our hermeneutic reach, no?
I was going to say that Toby was talking about Bartleby as a figure of how we deal with human suffering. And I was thinking as you were talking, it's a particular problem in this story because the point is not how you deal with human suffering when you can do something to alleviate it. The point is how do you deal with human suffering when there's nothing you can do to alleviate it, which seems like a larger problem and a problem all of us have. You want to be a person who reads the news. And one of the things I love so much about the story is that as soon as that starts happening in the mind of the narrator gets imaginatively really intimate with Bartleby. So he's like, well, let's go on a road trip and I'll take you to your friend or to a spa or something, and then you feel better. And he's about as far from Bartleby in that moment as possible, but his imagination is spinning and spinning and spinning. And I think one view of that is that that's just comic and they're actually more divided in that moment. But I think another view of it is that when the mind starts to work like that on the problem of human suffering, other tasks are called for by the imagination, not just helping somebody. Wanting to help somebody isn't always a good thing, seems to me. It's something where you get a lot of satisfaction about it, but it may do nothing for the other person.
Yeah, so I don't see Bartleby as suffering so much as some of you do. That is, he is almost indifferent. He's impassive. He doesn't need money. He doesn't want food. He is an ascetic. He has rejected this life. And he says, I'm not particular. I prefer not to do it, but I'm not particular, you see. So anything's fine. I can stay with you, but I don't impose change upon me. And so he's impenetrable. We don't hear anything about what he thinks. He doesn't do anything. You know, normally you judge characters by what they say and what they do and by what other people say about them. Bartleby's only got one line. He doesn't do anything except stand and look at the wall. And nobody says anything about him except that he's a mystery. So I think he's supposed to remain a kind of mystery, but he's a mystery the way many ascetics are. And by ascetic, I mean not only Christological types of, Western ascetics, but also the whole Eastern ones, those who give up this world. And so, there comes a point where one must, I suppose, also speak about the ending of the story that, in fact, most interpretations do. That after Bartleby dies, the lawyer says, I had no clue about this guy, except one he was reported to have worked in the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., and he proceeds to explain what this dead letter office was, which apparently still exists now, except that instead of destroying the letters now, these are letters that have been written to people who have deceased in the meantime. So they don't reach their destination. And there's a sector of the post office that has to go through these letters that can't be delivered and look into them, because some, as the lawyer says, contain a gold ring. Yeah. So, here's somebody proposing marriage to somebody. Others have checks, they have cash. They're all letters, in short, that could have and should have received a destinataire and potentially have changed their lives. That is, it's all about futurity, about bettering one's life, but the people in the meantime have died. So Bartleby would have been working in this rather depressing situation, which is a communicative situation not reaching its purpose, okay? And as Toby pointed out, he's now instead employed copying things, and he's copying documents that are documenting the wealth and the riches of people who are on top of the world, right? So all of that is there too. It is about compassion. It's about the law. You're trying to figure out, how do we deal with a person like this who's totally different? And we're surrounded by them everywhere. Half of the homeless, you're not going to be able to talk to reasonably and even give them a job that they're going to do reasonably. So there are people in the world who just don't fit into our system, but that system is clearly and unequivocally the American sort of capitalist industrial activity where the law exists in order to say this is right and this is wrong, and this is mine, and that's yours. And so all of that system is one that Bartleby doesn't fit into. And it's kept, kind of just a skeletal, it's not explicit. That's what I think makes the story great, is that it has us thinking about this stuff.
That's absolutely right. And occasionally it does become almost explicit. For example, when he talks about the value of turkey and nippers to him, and also this wonderful phrase when he refers to that, of course, has a bit of a funny tail on it, when he refers to Bartleby as a valuable acquisition. And he does view these people in his office as instrumental, and as there to serve, really, and to serve him and to serve his system, and the challenge to that system that Bartleby represents, creates this avalanche of comic effects, but also ending in those last images of Bartleby in the tombs. For all the comedy of this story, there's something really haunting about that.
Just one quote to follow up, and it doesn't reflect well on the narrator, but he says about Bartleby, well, he's useful to me. I can get along with him. If I turn him away, the chances are he will fall in with some less indulgent employer, and then he will be rudely treated and perhaps driven forth miserably to starve. Yes, here I can cheaply purchase a delicious self-approval.
Yes.
To befriend Bartleby, to humor him in his strange willfulness, will cost me little or nothing, while I lay up in my soul what will eventually prove a sweet morsel for my conscience. So this is more than pragmatic. This is, negotiating, the terms of one's. You're buying your salvation. You're paying off your debt of guilt by being charitable to this character.
I think what's interesting about that is that actually travels on the same highway as possible acts of generosity, beauty, and grace, right? So he's doing that, and he's also going to the grub man and buying extravagantly Bartleby a dinner that he sort of knows at that point he's not going to eat, which seems to me a purely aesthetic gesture in some way. And I think that's very human, that the narrator both wants to purchase for himself cheaply a form of self-approval, and also has this capacity that I think Melville is able to point out or to underscore of greater and more beautiful acts of self. Doesn't mean he does them, but that to me is very human, that we have on one day we might be a meager version of ourselves, and 5 minutes later we might be capable of imagining something very beautiful.
And when the lawyer sees Bartleby dead, although even that's not perfectly explicit, his eyes are open and he's on his side in a sort of fetal position, all curled up in front of the wall, but his eyes are open. And the grub man says, well, so is he going to eat again tonight, or he's alive, right? And the lawyer says, yes, with kings and counselors, and closes his eyes. Well, that is a line, as I mentioned, right, referring to Job, who was the unjustly suffering, creature of God, the beloved of God in many ways, like Abraham, who was made to suffer. So the man Bartleby is often presented as a type of saint, but obviously a saint who can't be a proper copyist.
So we can open it up to questions from all of you. Please feel free. There's microphones, roving microphones.
Okay, I've got one short one and or one long one and several short ones that have come in. So we want to balance between.
So you want to start with yours, Cynthia, or what?
I can start with the long one, and then short ones later.
Jean-Pierre.
Melville was deeply depressed during the time Bartleby was written. He experienced vision problems. He was alienated from his best friend and mentor, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He did not want to copy his commercially successful novels, but rather to write deeply human and psychological works. He thought his writing ended in the dead letter office. A fire at Harper's, his publisher destroyed all the plates of his novels and all the copies which were still for sale. Clearly, his lawyer, judge, father-in-law must have exerted pressure for him to write what he preferred not to write. Each time I read it, it seems more obvious the comparisons between Bartleby and Melville himself. I guess that's not a question, but I thought you might want to comment on that.
So I was thinking that sometimes it's not writing, but sometimes the writing itself is a preferring not to and not writing. And I'm thinking about two things that Melville wrote, which is a novel called Pierre, the Ambiguities, and his poem Clarel, which is one of the longest poems in the English language. It's written in octosyllabic couplets. And are you all already asleep? Like nobody's read that thing except for like me and 10 other people. And like, I think both of those things are things he wrote. Like he actually wrote them. He did not write them, right? He wrote them, but both of them present vexing challenges for the reader. They're not the kind of traditional narrative. And it's sort of interesting to look at Bartleby and think about whether or not within the story there are expectations for traditional narrative forms of closure or characters that the story kind of denies. Whether there are buried stories in this story, like is there a love story buried in this story that doesn't really get out of the gate? Is there a queer love story in here that doesn't get out of the gate? Or is there I think the story is being a tragedy and a comedy layered on top of each other. And there's like a tragic version and a comic version. And in the comic version, maybe the narrator goes back to live at his old law office and Bartleby continues to control him or something like that. And is there a family comedy going on here too? Is there a possible something like that? So I think about that when I read the story too, the ways that writing itself can be a kind of no in its accomplishment too.
Do you think this story is saying no to the expectations of himself as an author? Katie, for you.
Well, Toby said it earlier too, right? That what we want from Melville is a nice old-fashioned seafaring story where there's an adventure or something like a whale, and like people are in real danger, you know. And instead, we have a character of Bartleby who's obviously in danger, but not the kind of exciting danger that you think about, you know, the characters in Moby Dick as being. So there's that part of it. Do I think it's a way of defying his, you know, father-in-law's expectations for him or something like that? I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like a great writer is always getting out of the problem of just wanting to defy someone's expectations for them and doing something richer than that, I suppose. But
I just think that Moby Dick is also his way of saying no, because that novel defied every expectation, and he almost self-destructed by writing such a story. But
Right.
I need a microphone. I realized in reading the story that I was very involved with the narrator, and I felt so much empathy with the narrator. Bartleby was there, and yet I wanted to think about how he could have done something. He couldn't have done anything, but I thought that's what made the story quite extraordinary, because very few short stories did I feel so compelled to realize that this story was about the narrator.
And that's why I think it's ultimately about compassion and the story, the plot of compassion, and the inability of compassion to reach beyond the wall.
Yeah.
The recipient. So, yes, there you go. We have someone here.
There's a phrase in the book that resonates in a kind of a strange way. The narrator says, "Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as passive resistance." And of course, when you think of passive resistance, you think of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who very much had a purpose in doing it. But Bartleby doesn't seem to have any purpose at all. He, unless he's secretly trying to destroy the society around him, which he doesn't have much of a chance of doing. But is it a protest or an attempt to change the world? It's just a strange resonance.
I think that's one of the most interesting things about this story. The narrator really wants to know. We learned that he worked in a dead letters office, and he looks for some kind of reason in that fact. It's really not going to give it to you. He wants to talk to Bartleby, get his background. He wants to understand him in this analytical way that we think we understand people. And Bartleby will not give that. The story will not give it. This is an obdurate mystery that we're confronting in this story, and we're not going to be relieved of that mystery. And I think that's really one of the really we have this almost unconquerable desire to have these answers, to be given in some way in what we read and the people we know, the reason that this is that way, that this person is that way. And Melville has an intuition here that some of these things are beyond that. And Bartleby certainly is, and the challenge that he presents to the compassion of the narrator and by extension the reader, because how can we read this and not be infuriated with Bartleby? Just on the narrator's behalf, if not our own. But you start explaining him away, that all vanishes like smoke.
Yeah, in fact, that's why I would say, Katie, I would have added an 8th point in the bad Bartleby, which is that he lacks generosity. Because when you're in need of help and you refuse any kind of help, this is assuming that he is in need of help, maybe he's not, but it's, there's also a generosity in reception. It's not always giving that's the source of generosity. Sometimes it's your humility or willingness to accept help that is also a form of self-giving. And so there's something so solipsistic about Bartleby that he cannot be reached from the outside, and nor will he give himself to help from any other source. And that could be a prideful, I don't know. I'm going against the mystification of Bartleby as being someone who harbors some inner secret that is very critical of our capitalist or law of sovereignty or the power of the negative. All these heavy hitting people like Zizek, Giorgio Agamben, Gilles Deleuze, all these heavy theorists with a heavy breathing around Bartleby as a hero of something that's very revolutionary. Maybe he just lacks the generosity to open himself up to, if not help, at least communication. Question? Sure.
Thank you. Very early in the story, the narrator talks about how he's settled for a very comfortable life, very profitable work. And there's a question of whether he sacrificed a search for a real vocation for money. And in some sense, when people have a real vocation, their time starts to have value to them. and they attract people where time is valuable for them, and you all have their time's valuable. And what you perhaps see with this narrator is having settled for just a comfortable financial job. All the eccentrics, he doesn't know how to get the real dedicated people. He doesn't know how to get and be able to help these eccentrics develop a vocation on their own. And all his compassion for Bartleby is kind of a reflection of his own falseness, or his inability to connect because he has a false life in some sense. Yeah, that's fine.
We have to take the mic because
Sure, that's fine.
seems to be functioning.
So I love how you're talking about the story, because in talking about it, you're talking about the law office, not just like it's a place of work, but like it's a school, right? Or like it's parents and children. So it's a person who has a vocation, who wants to teach people who don't have a vocation what it might be like to have a vocation. And that's the kind of educative process that I think lots of people feel like isn't part of their workplaces, right? Their workplace is just where you go and you do your job and then you go home. I know lots of people learn things at work, but in talking about it like this, I think part of what you're reminding me about the story is that if work is all you have, and this whole story is only about a workplace, there's none of these people's homes are talked about, except at the end we get that tiny glimpse of the grub man and his wife in the tombs, then it's going to become everything to you. Then the workplace is going to become a school, and it's going to become a family. And I think a lot of Americans actually have this experience where work has become so much a part of their life that all of their emotional energy goes into it. And there may be people at your workplace who think about it like a vocation, and then there may be people at your workplace who think about it like taking out the trash. And there they are thrown together in this great, weird, great spirited American thing called work, which we all sort of in our weird capitalist way really love and give a lot of meaning to. But giving meaning to something isn't something it's something a lot of us do really differently. And so there's going to be all this chafing, I think, about that in some way.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have always been tempted to confront, maybe I should say, compare Bartleby and the hero of Albert Camus' novel, A Stranger. Maybe because I'm French, but that's not the reason. Appearances point to a radical opposition between the two characters. Bartleby always says, I prefer not to. Meursault, the name of the stranger, is perfectly indifferent to anything. He has no preferences, opposed to systematically negative preferences. Meursault makes love with Marie, his girlfriend. She asks, do you love me? Doesn't mean anything to me. Probably not. Do you want to marry me? Yes, but you just said that you didn't love me. Doesn't make any difference. He's radically indifferent. Well, that's the appearance, radical opposition between the two characters. But of course, there are similarities. And as Tom Harrison said, Bartleby's systematic negation looks more like an indifference also. So we have at this level, some similarity. But I see a much more profound similarity, and I wouldn't like to shock you. Neither character exists because they are the result of a lie, of a deception, probably a self-deception on the part of the authors. Lie, deception can be beautiful. That's not the problem. In the case of Meursault, of Camus' hero or anti-hero, it's obvious. I'm being told that this novel by Camus, which was written approximately 1 century after Bartleby, is still read worldwide, and especially by young people who systematically side with the hero or the anti-hero. They sympathize with him. Why? Because he's excluded by society. But that's his grandeur, his prestige. And but when you read a novel, I don't want to speak too long. When you read a novel, you understand that far from being excluded by society, is excluded by himself. But it doesn't cry at the funeral of his mother. First line, no. For that sin, he will end up being guillotined. But that's what happens. The problem is that in the middle of the novel, he kills an Arab whom he had never seen. Why this crime? There is a trial. The president asks, why did you do this? You certainly remembered Meursault's response, the son. That's not a response, of course. This crime is perfectly gratuitous. Without this crime, never the prediction that he would die at the end of the novel would occur. You are not guillotined, even in the Algeria of Camus, because you don't cry at the funeral of your mother. Okay, so it's a pure invention. That doesn't diminish the aesthetic beauty of the novel of L'Étranger. I'm wondering whether similar things couldn't be said about Bartleby. After all, Bartleby commits suicide at the end. He stops eating, etc. You could say also that Meursault commits suicide because he has to kill someone that he knows very well that he kills someone, he will end up being guillotined. So it's a question I put to you. Do you think that Bartleby is really a character or a made-up character that has no substance? Camus, okay, let's talk about the two. I'm all finished. The two, when they wrote their respective works, the two novelists had serious problems. Camus was suffering from not being recognized enough, etc. And so he blames the society around him. Society was excluding him. How about Melville? If I remember, when he wrote Bartleby, he was extremely affected by the fact that Moby Dick didn't have the success that he wished it should have. So, etc., etc. So I don't know if this comparison makes sense, but it's a question that I put to the panelists or to you, Robert.
No, I don't have an answer to, but I mean, I think that when you talk about how the young readers respond to Meursault, and I was reading a thing in, one it's kind of low life iNews things that you get on your thing, and who was it? Who's that actress Brooks? She was saying why she doesn't like to work with Gen Z people because they say, well, nah, I'm not feeling it today. I'm not going to come to work, or I'm going to come at 10:30. And I realized these are the Bartlebys. I prefer not to. And there's a certain attitude among a generation that feels like if I prefer not to, I'm not going to do it. And there's this idea of obligation. But Meursault, of course, the difference between these two characters is substantial because Bartleby never reveals his inner passion. Whereas at the end of L'Étranger, Meursault has this very passionate reaction right before he's going to be executed, and he reveals that he's completely human, and he's full of capacity for emotion and sentiment and rage and so forth.
I was right. I was right. I was always right. That's
right. That's right.
Well, this emotion is completely false. You know anyone who enjoys being about to be guilty, to be excluded from society?
Yeah.
This is yes.
But he's capable of the gesture of passion, whereas Bartleby,
Right.
I cannot imagine Bartleby having an outburst like that.
But
All that remains to complete my happiness is the howls of execration of the crowd when I am led out to my execution. It's the last line of the novel.
But how could Bartleby ever be heard in such an emotional landscape? I think I just disagree, because Bartleby says, I prefer not to quit you. And in the middle of the emotional landscape, at the kind of, I'm thinking, let's get back to Gen Z, because that's where this conversation really is, right? Because Gen Z doesn't want to come into work at 10:30, and they also think that an expression of passion is like, well, I guess I sort of like you, right? And it's the same thing with Bartleby in a world full of explosions and constant breaking news on top of your computer. Like, what are you supposed to do in terms of your, I don't know. Like, so the question on the table is Bartleby real, or is he made up? And the thing I wonder is whether or not the earnestness of his emotion is fairly hard to see with an earnest narrator whose own emotions are constantly crowding the emotional landscape of the story. And those few turns of phrase he has, which change like a mantra, I prefer not to quit you, that just changed just a little bit. I kind of wonder, is there something in that that's actually speaking volumes louder than a lot of the sorts of emotions we're talking about?
I'd like to say only one thing. I find this comparison absolutely compelling with Meursault and The Stranger. And it's the negativity of the two characters. That is, these are two alienated figures. They're existential figures. They're alienated. And if I go back to my Turkey and Nippers, there comes a time, and it precedes existentialism. I mean, you can find it in Hamlet. That's how old it is. But there comes a time, for instance, these two characters, which I called very much Dickens characters, they're even more Lawrence Stern characters. They're subjects who can't control themselves. They can't control their lives. That's why they have the indigestion and the alcoholism and so on. So this dissociation from one's work, which we can compare to any generation, I wouldn't pick on the youngest and the most indefensible of today, but this dissociation is what you're finding in Camus, as well as 100 years earlier in Melville.
We have one back there. Is there a mic in the back?
Shoot.
No?
We have an online question, and then I'll give it to him. Yes. Jody Glider said, Bartleby never said no, he always preferred not to. And yet nobody ever challenged him to make a more clear response. Do we learn anything from the narrators never choosing to challenge the equivocation? And by the way, somebody asked, anonymous, do you ever see parallels between Bartleby's incessant I prefer not to and Poe's Raven's nevermore? Neither will leave, nor will they explain.
Anyone?
We have seen the narrator. We have seen the narrator on several occasions say, "Do you really mean to tell me you're not going to copy this thing?" And I mean, he does explode now and then, and he's certainly. I mean, it's part of the humor of his helplessness before this inert creature.
And in fact, if Bartleby said he refused to do a job, he'd be fired on the spot. What confounds the lawyer is that Bartleby says, I prefer not to. That is, he doesn't take the either or. He exists in a world where only either or is understood. The law exists in order to attribute right here and blame there. And the lawyer is unable to judge Bartleby. That is, I don't think we should either. That is, he's unjudgeable. He's outside the parameters of what makes sense. And it's there that the lawyer moves towards Christianity, which says you cannot or should not judge your neighbor. You have to give them the benefit of the doubt. Compassion, therefore. Bartleby is impenetrable, but he seems to be a good guy. There's nothing wrong with him. And if he did categorically choose yes or no, then he would be culpable. But he evades that the way Merceau sort of evades, do you love me or do you not? Well, I don't know. Do I need to choose A or B? Maybe the truth is somewhere in between.
Yeah,
Let's
go ahead.
Hello, I'm in the back, so I'll stand up. I really appreciate the panelists' analysis very much, especially the discussion about compassion in this story. And I was imagining, what would the story be like if the lawyer hadn't expressed compassion for Bartleby? It would be ruined. This story we wouldn't be here talking about it, right? So that's what's so compelling to me, is the compassionate element in the story. So I have one observation that I just want to share with everyone, and forgive me if it's somewhat odd. And then I have a question. One is, while listening to you speak about this story, I thought about the movie Brazil, this bureaucratic dystopian nightmare which is about work, right? And I'm not really sure where I'm going with that, but I'm thinking of other examples of Bartleby-like characters in literature or film. And also I thought of Star Trek and the Borg. So if you multiplied Bartleby by 1 million, you'd get a species of Bartleby, and it would be maybe something like the Borg, right? And if I remember, that's a very long show, Star Trek: The Next Generation, and if any of you are familiar with it, I believe there are a couple episodes where there is compassion expressed towards the species, the Borg. And what's really interesting is that for so many episodes, you perceive the Borg as this kind of Bartleby-like character, void, flatlined, and all these kinds of things, right? But it builds up to, I don't remember if it's Jean-Luc Picard or somewhere, but there is this expression, and then we can get into Data and all these other kinds of post-human kind of, where we're headed, right? The post-human critiques that we're hearing now in literature and things like this. So I feel I'm waiting for the post-human and critique of Bartleby, and I can't wait for somebody to go there. I don't know if I have time to do it myself. So the question I have, so thank you for the, let me share my comments. The question I have is that in the beginning, the lawyer mentions that, he says, after a few words touching his qualifications, I engaged him. So he hires him because he's qualified, right? But at the end of the story, the narrator says, oh, there's this rumor about his previous work. I can't completely verify it, which is the dead letters thing that he does. So there's this weird, interesting disconnect. I'm trying to, that's my question. So in one way, there's this big mystery. So it's like unanswerable question. What is he? He's qualified, right? But it's not the dead letters job. It can't be that. It can't be that, right? Because if that's speculative. So that's my question. I hope that was clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, the Star Trek is the Borg episodes in The Next Generation, it's a little problematic within this context because there is no resistance. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. Death is irrelevant. Freedom is irrelevant. You will be assimilated. So there's no quiet resistance from the Borg's point of view to the inevitable assimilation of all other life forms into their own collective. The resistance that comes from the Enterprise and Picard and others is a very active resistance. It's not a passive resistance. So it would be interesting in our post-human context to imagine what it would be like to quietly say, I prefer not to. And I think a lot of people are very quietly, for example, disconnecting from the Borg collective, which is the internet and social media, Facebook and all these things. And that sort of saying quietly a no, which without making a big fuss about it, is something that's, more and more seems to be a viable response to this very aggressive demand that want to assimilate into the drones of the Borg collective.
I like your question about the part of your question about Bartleby's job interview. So like when Bartleby goes in and has his job interview, you really want to know what that content of that conversation was. And I think one of the things that's underneath that is part of what you want, because of the ending of the story, is for him to have handed over a resume that says dead letter office and has and he doesn't. And so what I imagine, just to be nuts and bolts about it, what I imagine that initial conversation was like when he asked him what his qualifications were, is what I imagine the other conversations that he had with Nippers and Turkey were like, which are some kind of weird, intuitive, will you work here well with me kind of funny thing, right? Do you know how to write? Have you copied a thing? And the reason why I think that's interesting is, I think it's a good question. I think it's an interesting moment. It's interesting for the same reason that the presence of the law all over the story is interesting. Because wouldn't it be nice if there was a law that just told you how to deal with Bartleby? And in this story, there's a little bit of a dream of that at the end of the story, that he's going to go to the law and the law is going to be like, well, this is who Bartleby's responsibility is. And then the story goes forward and kind of disregards that and just continues to create a problem for it. And I think that's a problem for us right now in this country. Wouldn't it be nice if there was just a law that could help us deal with some of our stickier political problems? You guys probably know the ones I'm talking about. And I think the law kind of sits in its presence in this story, just like the dream of Bartleby's full and complete resume, as the false card of the solution or the answer, when the problem isn't something that can be solved with something like that in some way. And I don't know why the narrator seems to be this kind of person who doesn't want to find out exactly what someone's job history was, but he's also the kind of person who, when Bartleby says, I prefer not to, doesn't immediately call the cops on him or like take him and his stuff and put him on the curb. Not sure what that means, right? There's some interest, but also, is it erotic interest? Is there something even more interesting than your interest happening? It's not, it's one of the interesting ambiguous things in the story that keeps me going back to the story.
Hello. Now, Bartleby sits facing the wall without moving. There are many variations of Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhism, for example, in which the primary activity is taking a comfortable position and facing the wall and remaining immobile. And so one might ask, there are other aspects of Moby Dick that strike me as very Buddhistic too. But one may ask, why come to that situation? One suffers. Why do anything? After all, one's headed toward death, no matter what you do, death and dissolution, whatever you do. So one might suffer with this if one is self-absorbed and doesn't appreciate the opportunity to express oneself in life, then one might go in that direction in meditation. So what brings a person to meditation? And one of the things that strikes me, is particularly in view of the discussion that some of you have made, is that the question of compassion. for me, especially after listening to you, my impression is not so much that the narrator's compassion is the important thing, but rather it's, you don't see it, but Bartleby trying to have compassion for himself, because that's the only exit for him.
Yeah, so yeah, the question of Buddhism is very interesting, because there's a life denial, if you want to put it in strong terms, or a sense that there's something about human existence which is objectionable, and that you can adopt an attitude towards it of, I would prefer not to live, essentially. That seems to be Bartleby's existential choice, that he makes himself unwilling to participate in the rules of the game. And it could be that the rules of the game of life are not either fair, or they're certainly, they can be meaningless and absurd. There's a fundamental absurdity at the heart of existence. And so maybe he's choosing to opt out of that game for good reasons, but at the same time, most of the rest of us, represented by the narrator, are committed to the game, and we have to find ways to, continue somehow getting through the day as best we can. When we need help, the other comes to our aid to get through the day. And one cannot have contempt for the ordinary struggle, to get through the day that is represented by the narrator's point of view, even if we can understand why Bartleby might have very good reasons to say no to the ultimate meaningless, absurd things of life. What's that? Well, we don't know if he's suffering. We actually don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we'll have one more, and maybe, yeah, there's one more here. And one more online. Hold on first.
I just want to say that I think I want to bring it back to an American story, because the narrator, who is, I think, more important than Bartleby, says, I am a man who from his youth upwards has been filled with profound conviction that the easiest way of life is the best. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man. I think that's so much the ethic of our country, of our nation, of our people. We want to be easy. We want the simple answers, which is why we go toward the leaders we have and the solutions that we think are the easy answers and safe answers. And the fact is, for real meaning in life, if there is, we have to make those answers, and it's not easy.
Yeah, that's very well said. And if there's ever a story that unsettles our desire for safety and a sense of security, that we know what's going on, I mean, it's this story that throws into crisis our sense that we know where we are and what we're up to. So thank you for that. So Cynthia, do you have one last question?
Here's
for
one
online,
last
then
question.
We'll wrap up.
Okay, from Jean Slater. Isn't it more illuminating to see Bartleby as existing within the narrator, as a product of the lawyer's decision to live an easy life, as a double of the lawyer, as his unconscious, and no saying of the unconscious that can't be explained or penetrated? At the same time, isn't Bartleby a vision of the power of nihilism, a silent cousin of the underground man 10 years later, created out of the same interest of Melville's, as Dostoevsky's in the nature of meaning in a world where God is rejected? Go for it.
I would agree with that person in many respects. I think that, and we just said it in the last contribution that the man made here, is that there is a sense in which Bartleby is the unconscious of our way of thinking. Therefore, he's the lawyer's unconscious. It's what the lawyer tries to keep in control and repress, really. He's got to keep life simple, black and white, and so on and so forth. So that's true. And that means to view life as reasonable, understandable in rational terms, which is also what Dostoevsky calls into question with the underground man, who's a man who says, if I think that 2 and 2 equals 5, then I want it to be 5. I know it's 4, but I insist that it's 5. That is, it's irrationalism. And it's in this period of history that reason and security, positivism, science, and so on, all comes into question. Spiritualism develops. And so Bartleby is part of that, I think, cultural scene.
Well, thank you all very much. We've gone beyond our, usual time. So we look forward to a spring event. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, bye.